So some of the things that we want to be talking to you about today. So we'll very briefly just touch on the story, the work and the people of UNICEF. We'll mention the functional areas that we focus on and the selection criteria for those. And then we'll spend a fair amount of time on our recruitment process and program, and initiatives. And very briefly touch on the application process. And then Nina has kindly offered to provide some insider tips, which I imagine will be very much of interest to the students. I am going to ask Emily just to let you hear a little bit from our own staff.
What I love most about working for UNICEF is the fact that we can intervene and do work all around the world. In the most remote area, we can make a difference for children.
I know my work contributes to something that serves a great purpose towards helping those who are most in need. And that's why every day at the office is something inspiring.
I wanted to work for UNICEF because it is an organization where you can make a difference in the life of children.
What I love every day when I come to work is the people I work with. I work with people from different countries, the diversity, and I learn so much about different cultures. That's what I love.
At UNICEF, you will work with dedicated and passionate colleagues to make a difference in the life of every child, delivering on the ground in 190 countries and territories, reaching the hardest to reach, the furthest from help. Our mandate inspires us to achieve results, to keep standards high, and to grow both professionally as well as personally.
What I love most about working for UNICEF is its people, the diverse culture and the energy level, and a chance to contribute to changing the lives of children in my very own small way.
Join us to make a difference for every child.
So some authentic voices from our own staff recorded using colleagues in our office here and also in more globally. So just as we wait for the presentation to come back, the UN has asked all of the different presenters sort of at the end, so, you know, what is the one reason that they would put forward for coming to work for UNICEF? And for me, it would be really that we are an organization that embraces diversity. And I appreciate that every single day when I come to the office, I work with such a wide variety of colleagues, and that's a great privilege. Sorry, a small technical glitch. We're just waiting for the presentation to come back. Okay, so a little bit about UNICEF. I mean, you may well know this, but in fact UNICEF was founded after the Second World War. So we have just last year celebrated our 70th anniversary. And I suppose the one thing to bear in mind, so started after the Second World War, huge crisis, huge humanitarian needs. We would have hoped that, in fact, we would have been able to put ourselves out of business, and 70 years later we remain as relevant as ever with all of the different conflicts and crises in the world. The work that we do, it's very wide-ranging, so some of the traditional areas that people might think of when they think of UNICEF are areas like child survival and child protection and education, some of the more fundamental program areas. But in fact, we're now branching out, we're doing a little bit more in terms of innovation for children. We've got special programs around that, and we're also looking to be more evidence-based in the work that we do. So research and analysis is a growing part of the work that we do. And I suppose the key thing, too, in the work that we do is we really look to be impartial and non-political. So we really don't differentiate in terms of providing support to children. People, so here we talked about the fact already, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, we work in 190 countries around the world, and we really truly are a diverse organization. There is great strength that comes out of the multicultural nature of the organization. It means that we are dynamic, and because we have different perspectives, it gives us the possibility to innovate. So typically at events like this, students are interested to understand a little bit about the areas that we work in and the skill sets that we're looking for. So I would say that in terms of functional areas that we look at, we've got three broad groups, I suppose. So the one is external relations. I hope you can read. It says communication, private sector fundraising, public partnerships, and resource mobilization. Program is broad, so I shan't read through all of it, but we run from adolescent development and child protection through to social inclusion, WASH, and emergency and humanitarian affairs. And then operations. Many people who come to these sorts of events assume that it's limited to areas like human resources and finance and IT. But we also employ legal people and quite a lot of people in the area of supply and logistics. So I'm going to make an assumption here. We have different staff categories and different contract types, but I'm going to assume for this audience that's here, you largely master students, that you are interested in an international professional career with UNICEF. We also have national officers who do professional level functions, but are nationals of the countries that they work in. And we also have general service roles who provide some support. But for international professionals, what do we look for? We look for diverse ranges of work experience. I can't stand here and tell you need X years of experience in a particular field, because each position has its own particular requirements, so you need to be looking at the vacancies on our website. Language skills, the key here is that English is required, proficiency in English is required, and then we also really value language skills. So we would suggest that it's very useful to have proficiency in another UN language. So those would be French and Spanish as other working languages in the organization, and then we have Chinese, Russian, and Arabic in addition. Academic qualifications, normally we ask for a master's, so those in the master's program are well on track to meet our requirements. And in exceptional situations for particular specialist posts, we may accept a bachelor's degree, but we really are looking for the best of the best, and we're looking for people who are well educated. And then, as Eva mentioned at the beginning, our director of HR, we're looking for people who are willing to be geographically mobile. So we do look for people to move between headquarters and regional offices and country office context and get a diversity of experience. And there is richness in that for the individual. Right, of the different types of programs that we have which might be of interest to you as a group, I suppose the first that I want to mention is the Junior Professional Officer. One of our speakers actually alluded to this. So this is a program that is funded by governments who typically support their own nationals, but there are a couple of our more benevolent donors who actually also support nationals of developing countries. And what we look to do is we look to bring in these junior professional officers, depending on the donor, for between 2 and 4 years. The requirement for entry for this program is a master's degree and at least 2 years' worth of experience. And then once our JPOs are on board, then we give them very strong career development support. Information on the JPO opportunities are on the various government websites, but we have links to those on our website. We have a program here called New and Emerging Talent Initiative. So this is specific to UNICEF. It's a mid-level professional program. So we're looking to appoint people at the P3 level. For this, you need a master's degree and about 5 years of experience. As we say here, you need proficiency in English, and we do mandate another UN language. So we're looking here for high potential individuals who, similar to the Junior Professional Officer program, get a very strong career development program, and then they are assisted in terms of growing up through the organization. So a great way to enter the organization and actually grow up through the different levels. And our netties have got a very strong reputation, so if you have the opportunity to work in this area, then you should grab it. Internship program, we are delighted to be able to announce that as of this year, we actually have made some significant changes to our internship program. So the one is related to payment. So we are now allowing our officers to pay a stipend. In fact, not just allowing them, but encouraging them to pay a stipend to students. And the other thing that we're doing is we have broadened the eligibility criteria. So from now on, we are going to be accepting people who enrolled in an academic program, but we're also going to be taking people as interns up until 2 years after graduation. We see the benefit to us as an organization in terms of getting young people in who have got enthusiasm and are looking to get some work experience. And we also see the benefit to you to young graduates who are looking to get that first or second bit of work experience and build their portfolio. Volunteers, quite a lot of people approach us and say that they would be interested in volunteering their time for UNICEF because they feel strongly about the mandate. And there are two ways currently that we would accept volunteers. So the first is, and you would remember that one of our speakers said that he started as a UNV. So there's the United Nations Volunteer Program, and we recruit quite a number of people in through this program to work in our country offices, our regional and country offices. Typically not in headquarters, although they're piloting that at the moment. And so there are different types of UNVs. The one that's probably going to be most of interest to you is the UN Youth Volunteers. So the requirements there are 18 to 29 years of age, less than 2 years of experience. In fact, in some cases, they don't, youth UNVs don't need any experience at all. And contract duration maximum of 2 years, so between 1 and 2 years. And then we also have UN Specialist Volunteers. So here we're looking for people with a little bit more experience, minimum 25 years of age and at least 2 years worth of experience. And these UNVs can serve for up to 4 years. One type of UNV that is not paid is the online volunteer. But for that, there is no minimum requirement. So if you're studying and you're interested in using your skills in some way that's beneficial to UNICEF, then you can look to volunteer your services or donate your services as an online volunteer. And then finally, of course, we need to mention the fact that quite uniquely, UNICEF has got national committees in industrialized countries, and they may well be interested in offers of support from students such as yourselves. Consultants, I think that Nina is going to mention this a little bit, but just to say we engage quite a lot of individuals as consultants, either to perform staff or non-staff functions. And again, this varies in terms of looking for relatively junior people, people with very little work experience, through to real experts who are sort of steeped in 15, 20 years of expertise in a particular area. Our consultancies are advertised on our recruitment website, and they can be based anywhere in the world. So a great opportunity during your, perhaps your vacations from university or once you've graduated to come and get some experience with us. We had a quick look at the numbers of consultants that were on board with us last year, and we thought that we would just give you a flavor of sort of the scope of the consultancy. So in New York, last year, we hired almost 890 consultants. So that's quite a lot. And here we're telling you the top areas that these people worked in. So it's largely programmatic, and then also communication and external partnership. I'm sorry, I'm sort of racing through, but I know that we're really tight on time, and I want to make sure we have time for the career fair afterwards. Okay, so just in brief, the UNICEF recruitment process. So I will start by saying that we have our own online recruitment system. Unfortunately, we are not aligned across the different UN organizations. So one of the things is if you're interested in working for UNICEF, you should even now go online and actually create an e-profile for yourself. And then when you've searched and found an opportunity, whether it's an internship, a consultancy, or even a staff function, if you've got some work experience, then of course you can upload your CV and your cover letter and you'll be ready to go. So we give our hiring officers quite a lot of flexibility. So the process that is followed differs by contract type. So what's shown up here is really what applies for selections for staff positions. So we may have a written assessment. So we have written technical tests. We sometimes use assessment centers, usually for senior level positions, and sometimes also situational judgment tests. Whether that happens or not, you're almost certainly going to be called to an interview, and here we have different interview types that we allow our hiring managers to do. So if you've been having a look at any of the materials available for other UN organizations, they'll be talking a lot about competency-based interviewing, CBI. And just to say we no longer mandate this, as of early this year, we decided that we would allow our managers to decide what selection approach actually would work best for their positions. So now what we say is that you need to applicants need to prepare themselves for any type of an interview. It might be something that's around your motivation for working for UNICEF. There might even be some technical questions that come in at that stage. Behavioral fit would be the competency-based interview. You might even be asked to prepare a presentation and to deliver it and then sort of host some kind of a discussion around that, or even to do a role play. And then if you're successful, it says here you will get an offer. So an offer might look like one of two things. If you're successful in a selection process, you might be offered a particular job. But if you're not the first candidate, then you might be put into a talent group. So the approach that we're taking much more at the moment is that UNICEF is moving towards populating talent groups. So we populate our talent groups primarily through advertising generic vacancy announcements. We go through a full selection process, and everybody who is found to be suitable gets put into the talent group. But we also occasionally have regular or batch vacancies. So that's where we are advertising either one job or a small number of jobs in the same functional area at the same level together. And so, yeah, I mean, you need to be looking out for all of these different types of opportunities in regard to staff positions. How can you apply? You need to bookmark our career website. On that, you can customize job alerts so that you can be notified when there are opportunities. Let's say, for example, internships in a particular functional area or in a particular duty station. And you can also follow the UNICEF jobs on Twitter and on UNICEF's LinkedIn page. I am now going to hand you over to Nina, who is going to give you some insider tips.
Okay, I'm the home stretch, right? Welcome to UNICEF, and to follow Jill, I thought I would tell you a little bit about, well, a very little bit about my path to UNICEF, and to connect to all of you. I started actually my career in an APSIA school. So I spent the first 5 to 7 years of my career outside of graduate school as the Career Services Director at SEPA. I also worked at Georgetown and probably visited every school on the campuses that are here, so welcome. I used to plan trips like this, and I thought that maybe my 10 or 15 minutes would comprise some ideas. I feel like after you visit a number of organizations, then the question is, okay, there are all these formal programs and hiring regulations, but I'm still not really sure what to do next. So I wanted to speak a little bit informally, which is why there's very little information on the slides, to give you a little bit of the inside scoop. After I left the APSIA world, and I really focused and always had a passion for international development and human rights careers. My area was career development and development, so to speak, and human rights. So I've spent about 15 years really choosing to work as a consultant among a range of international development organizations. I've worked with 6 UN agencies. I've worked with DevEx, the Ford Foundation, Realizing Rights, which is Mary Robinson's NGO, and my role has always been to really help people think critically about managing careers and life, and the very challenging nexus sometimes that happens when you're trying to work and raise a family and navigate the global context. So I've worked for UNICEF now for about 5 years. I was here half-time until a year ago, working on the career development function, and now I made the leap because I too, like Jill, fell in love with UNICEF and decided to go back full-time, and I head up the leadership development function. So at UNICEF, I really work with the top 200 leaders to help really create as fluid and empowering, I would say, a leadership culture here as possible. And it's a lot of fun, actually. Our leaders are really inspiring. You've met a few, but my role is to really give them the tools they need to help them lead teams effectively across countries. So that said, given what Jill had mentioned, a few tips. Sometimes we talk about internships and consultancies. Really, it is the best foot in the door. UNICEF gets hundreds of thousands of applications, like across the system, all UN agencies do. And I'll tell you honestly that if there is a UN name on your resume or your CV, I think it helps. I think it's a little bit about speaking the language and understanding the organizational culture. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a UNICEF intern to get a UNICEF consultancy or a UNICEF job, and we have many people who come in without that. I will say it helps to get a look if you've at least interned at UNHCR or you've had an experience at the Secretariat, and I think that's true actually across the system. So if you've been a UNICEF intern, it might mean that you'll get a closer look than at a place like the Secretariat or UNHCR. I do think it's worthwhile putting in some time thinking about an internship. I think consultancies are often the place where I've seen people coming out of graduate school get the easiest foot in the door. We've hired 3 or 4 graduate students relatively recently in our division. One started as a volunteer, one started as an intern, and then several just applied because they were interested in what we were doing. It is very helpful to have a second UN language. And then I think UNICEF is a little bit different from some of the other organizations in that we are really a technical agency. So that in nutrition, there's an expectation that you really have a depth of expertise about nutrition. Or if you were working in emergencies, that you've spent some time in an emergency, as opposed to a place like the UN Secretariat, which looks more at political science generalists, right, or social affairs generalists. I wanted to say a few words about resumes and the written application. And I would, we have a website called Agora. It's actually one we've chosen to be open. It's very rare at the UN to be open to anyone. So I would really encourage you to plug into Agora, A-G-O-R-A, agora.unicef.org, and you can create an account. And we have 2 very good e-learning modules on how to write a written application in a way to really get attention, and also how to prepare for an interview. I think a lot of what's in there is very relevant across the UN system. We use UNICEF language, we use UNICEF examples, but I would encourage you to think about, they'll take about 15 minutes each, but they're great ways to tap in. The other thing I'd like you to think about, and this is not just true for UNICEF, but across the system and beyond, but particularly in the UN system, is to read the vacancy announcement carefully. So if, for example, in a vacancy, it says 5 years of work experience required, as one HR professional said recently, that doesn't mean 4 years, 11 months, and 15 days, right? It means essentially 5 years. And you can count things separately, but really take it seriously. Because we don't want you to waste your time and apply for levels that might be too high, but we also want you to make sure that your application gets noticed. So the other thing to do is to go through the vacancy announcement and highlight what seem really like keywords that pop out at you. So if we're looking at a partnerships consultancy, and we read your application and the word partnerships isn't in there at all, it probably won't get read, even if you've done partnerships and you're calling it something else. Right? So incorporate the language of the VA very carefully in your cover letter, in your resume, and in your written application. And when I mention to incorporate the language, I would suggest that you look at a couple of different components of the vacancy. Usually there's some general text that says, this is what the job's about, or this is what the internship or consultancy is about. Then we have something called desired qualifications and competencies. Keep highlighting. So for desired qualifications, if it talks about 2 years of project management experience, you want to use that language to describe what you've done in your application. I would also say that at the UN, less is not often more. So a one-page resume will probably never get looked at. It should be a minimum of 2. Rare, I know, compared to some other language that you're hearing. I wanted to say something about what I call the T. And the T in career development is, and it's hard to make a T and hold a mic at the same time, but let me try to do that. I would think about your resume and your career as you're starting, and employers will think about this as a T. And by a T, I mean when you're presenting your skills and qualifications. The horizontal part of the T is generally considered our competency framework and how we look at general skills that we hope any UNICEF staff member, consultant, intern will have. They're really what we think about as the soft skills. How are your planning and organizing skills? Communication. Have you worked as part of diverse teams? How do you implement a vision? And when you look at our competency framework, which is also on the website, we really like to see evidence of those broad-based skills when you're describing your work experience. We also like to see the depth. And by the depth, I mean, what's your passion? What's your technical expertise? The depth might be communication, partnerships, emergencies. It can be almost considered your specialization in some of your graduate programs. So if it's international development, for example, what do we mean by that? Is it gender and development? Is it adolescent and youth participation? Is it democratization? Make sure when you're reading your resume and you're talking to your career offices that we can see both. We can see your core skills and we can see your T, yeah? The depth of your T. Is that helpful? Yes. Yeah, so Jill mentioned a bit about general service, international professional, consultant, international professional versus, or not versus, and national officer. We talk about a global, versatile workforce. We look for staff who are willing and interested in going to emergency duty station and non-emergency duty stations. If there's one you're more interested in than others, or you'll consider, it's helpful to know. It's helpful for you to think about. About 40%, and you've heard this, close to 40% of our staff right now are working in emergency situations. So I would say that's a growing area. That's where we're generally always actively recruiting. We also often get questions about regional specialty. So I'm really interested in South Asia. I'm really a Latin Americanist. I would say in general at UNICEF, we hire globalists. And I look even at our senior leaders and how we move around. So someone will be in South Africa and then maybe go to Bangladesh, then from Bangladesh to Nicaragua, and then maybe to Kazakhstan. Certainly, if you have an interest or a depth or an experience in a region, there's a good chance you'll get there. I think you're often even more appealing to a place like UNICEF if you have more than one experience, you know, and interest and experience in more than one region. So if you're thinking about an internship and you've worked in India and you'd really like to think about Nepal, certainly if that's your passion, do it, but I also encourage you to maybe consider Sierra Leone, you know, or Mexico or Kyrgyzstan. The other thing I wanted to mention is that all UN agencies, in essence, have what we call a competency framework. It guides our hiring process. You can go onto UNICEF and Google the UN competency framework. Ours is actually rather old now by UNICEF standard. It's 2012 or 11, and we're redoing it this year. Every UN agency has a different competency framework. However, there's a lot of overlap. And in the hiring process, it's very helpful to at least familiarize yourself with what it looks like. It gives you a sense of the broader top T, part of the T, that we really value and that we want to see evidence of. And then I just wanted to mention a little bit about LinkedIn and networking, because here too, I think it's a little bit different. When we speak to student groups, a lot of times we'll then get many LinkedIn invitations, right? And I think at in the UN system, I would be a little more cautious about that because it is a little bit more formal. There's a little bit more of a hierarchy and a bureaucracy. Rather than invite people through LinkedIn, I would think about more following and looking, kind of using it as a research tool. We do advertise on LinkedIn. You'll find that UN staff are slower to be part of LinkedIn, I think because it's, there's so much of an internal network. It's growing, and I think it's generational as well. I would think a little bit when you're talking to the business partners outside, ask them, how do you use LinkedIn when you're recruiting? How should we be following up with you? Because the networking culture is a little bit different here. And I think these, hopefully these bullet points will give you some ideas about the sorts of questions as we move out to your HR business partners, our HR business partners that you're about to meet, some good food for thought. Yeah. So with that, I think Jill and I really wanted to open it up and see if you had any quick questions before we head out back.
Yes, I assume there are going to be a lot of questions. This must be the most valuable presentation for you for this afternoon. And so let's get maybe two generic questions, because our next session would be actually to ask more specific questions for each, maybe the JPO program or NETI program, or with our HR business partners. So is there any generic question here? Okay.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to know if you have like HR data or stats, like if you have any numbers supporting IP positions like P2, P3 in the past year versus, you know, GS, or, and even more granular, do you have like where regional, where you're recruiting most for and stuff like that?
Yeah, I was going to say we certainly have the data. We have a lot of data at UNICEF, so we definitely have the data. What specifically is your question about that? Kind of where the, can you?
For example, the IP, are you recruiting more like internally within the UN system, or you're getting like more external, you know, people applying for jobs? Yeah.
So we've actually relatively recently sort of done a review of our recruitment, because we're in the middle of recruitment reform. We're in the middle of HR reform generally, and about 70% of our positions are filled internally. But that does mean there's 30% that are being filled externally. So we're always looking to bring in, I hate the expression fresh blood and new ideas, but new people. One more question.
Hi, could you clarify whether or not there's a term that, as employees for UNICEF, whether there's a 5-year, 3-year, and a reapplication process? Is that still the case?
Yes, I think in general, people get a 2-year often for an actual post. An IP post or GS post, a 1 or a 2-year, what we call a fixed term contract. You often don't need to reapply for that. However, if you're interested in another job, you apply internally. So if Jill, for example, was interested in my job after I left, our boss couldn't just move her over. Well, Court of could, but we have some, but you generally would apply. If we were at the same level as we are, then you can sometimes laterally do that. Often it's still more of a direct application. That is one of the things I would say that's really changing right now and in flux a bit. The consultancy time, which you didn't ask and probably would also be a good thing to mention, is varies. Often we'll start with a 3-month consultancy, which is really like a trial to see how the working relationship goes. And then you often will get, if it's a good fit and if the work continues, you might get another 3 months, then you might get a 6 months. But consultancy contracts range between 3 and 11 and a half months.
Okay, one more question.
I don't know if this is too specific of a question, but I've been looking at UNICEF positions in a particular country, and I've been finding that they're only really looking for citizens of that country. So I'm just wondering if there are certain countries that are looking for specifically individuals from citizens and other countries that are more open to having individuals from other countries?
It's a very good question.
Yeah, so I mean, we do have some more developed countries, I suppose, sort of the middle, in what we would call middle and higher income countries, where there are the capacity in country. And so many of the positions, whether they are support functions and support functions by definition, you're supposed to be recruiting nationals of the country. But where even more professional functions are filled by what we refer to as national officers rather than international professionals, you will always find the head of the office is an international posting. But if you're looking at something sort of lower or mid-level, yeah, then it might well be, depending on the country context, that it is nationalized.
Yeah, I would say in a country office in general, and you can, I guess, probably know this statistic better than any of us in the room, between 70 and 80% of the staff in a UNICEF office are national staff, for obvious reasons, for any of you that are studying, right, development, for sustainability, for empowerment, to keep things, and that's really our philosophy. So when you look at the top tier of the office is often where the international professional staff are, and so the exceptions being JPOs, UNVs, NETIs. Often if we're going to send an international professional in, we want to make sure that they're playing a role that maybe a national from that country might not have in terms of a global or regional perspective.